Hi, I'm Brian with BibleStudying.net, and we left off talking about Christianity, and we said the next step was to go forward and talk about a religious view, a worldview called Gnosticism. So what is Gnosticism? Well, we're going to spend some time talking about its doctrines a little bit later in the study, but right now we're concerned with its historical documentation and what we can know about it historically. And I'm going to read some quotes on that. According to the Columbia Encyclopedia, they talk about the Nag Hammadi documents, which was the discovery of ancient texts and in recent times. And they state that until the text's discovery, knowledge of Christian Gnosticism, because Gnosticism had a Christian flavor to it, it used Christian terms to describe its own worldview. Knowledge of Christian Gnosticism was confined to reports and quotations of their Orthodox opponents, such as Irenaeus and Tertullian. So you have Irenaeus and Tertullian, who are Orthodox Christians. They have, particularly in the case of Irenaeus, they have connection to the apostles. And they are refuting the Gnostics, and until the Nag Hammadi documents were discovered, the only way that we knew anything about ancient Gnosticism was to look to the way that the early Christian critics described it, and that was it. Of course, what happened was, when we did find the documents themselves, it turned out that the early Christian writers were incredibly accurate in what they were saying about Gnosticism at the time. So this tells us again that the Christianity is not only concerned about being accurate when it describes its own views and its own history, but it's also wanting to be accurate when describing its opponents, which is interesting, and gives it additional credibility. So what else do we know about these documents in Gnosticism? Well, in terms of its documentation, we find some teachings of it, some writings of it, that were discovered. And Britannica describes this under their article on Gnosticism. They say this teaching is to be found in the Apocryphon of John, an early 2nd century AD work, and other documents of popular Gnosis, in the Pistis Sophia, a 3rd century Gnostic work in Coptic belonging to the same school. So when we look for writings, we find that their writings come from the 2nd and 3rd century AD. So this is just in terms of when the originals were being written, and they're after the original New Testament was written. So they're coming later than the New Testament. Largely what we're going to be doing with Gnosticism is sort of comparing it to Christianity and saying which of these is the true view of Jesus and his teachings. And what we find here, of course, is that their writings are later, that the Christian New Testament writings were in closer proximity to Jesus, and they were written by people that knew Jesus. And this is the next point. If we read from Britannica concerning the Gnostic writers, it says, among the leading 2nd century Christian Gnostics was Saturninus and Basilides, who were reputedly pupils of Menander, a disciple of Simon Magus, who's a New Testament figure, actually, in the book of Acts, describes Simon Magus and how he had basically made some statements that were basically blasphemous, that he was trying to be getting the Holy Spirit, the power of the Holy Spirit, to distribute to other people. He wanted to pay for this. And the New Testament and the early Christians attributed the development of Gnosticism, particularly Christian Gnosticism, to Simon Magus. And then it goes on here and says that Simon Magus was the alleged founder of the movement, and it then describes Basilides and Valentinus are reported to have written extensively. So the writings that we have about this time coming from Basilides and Valentinus, they're said to have written extensively, and their systems can be reconstructed from hostile accounts by Irenaeus, and Irenaeus is a 2nd century figure. So again, the writings from these individuals, from the Gnostic founders, are basically coming after the New Testament documents. And what's interesting is that they're being refuted. What the Gnostics have to say about Jesus and Christianity is being refuted by people who were in direct line of contact with Jesus. So Irenaeus was discipled by Polycarp. Polycarp was discipled by John, Jesus' own apostle, and of course John knew Jesus personally. So they had a direct line of connection, and yet they were refuting the Gnostics. So when we go to historical evidence, in terms of eyewitnesses and proximity, the reliability falls on the side of Irenaeus, who's refuting the Gnostics, and their writings come later. And so we would favor heavily, just based on historical evidence, the Orthodox view of Christianity in the 2nd century versus the Gnostic view of Christianity. And so let's talk a little bit about some of the content of what the Gnostics believed. Britannica states that when it comes to Gnosticism, that of Valentinus and Basilides, their schools presupposes this popular gnosis, which, however, has been thoroughly Hellenized and Christianized and sometimes very near to the views of Middle Platonism. So we have a lot of philosophical relationship and similarity to Platonism here. And the Columbia Encyclopedia talks about Gnosticism, saying, scholars trace these salvation religions, that are Gnosticism, back to such diverse sources as Jewish mysticism, although with a Jewish flavor, still mysticism, Hellenistic mystery cults, Iranian religious dualism, see Zoroastrianism, In Babylonian and Egyptian mythology, Christian ideas were quickly incorporated into these synchronistic systems. So you can see that this definitely falls into the sort of global mystical scheme with its ideologies, but now they're applying Christian terms to this scheme. And so that's a little bit about the ideology behind Gnosticism, which, as I said, we'll talk a little bit more about later. Let's move on to the next movement, which is Mandaeanism, and it's very closely related to Gnosticism, as it turns out. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, Mandaeanism means having knowledge, so very similar to how the Greek word gnosis is a word for knowledge. So you can see that relationship there. They say it's ancient Middle Eastern religion, still surviving in Iraq, and usually treated as a Gnostic sect. It resembles another religion known as Manichaeism in some respects, and we'll talk about Manichaeism here in just a moment. And so the next quote here comes from the Columbia Encyclopedia, and they state concerning the Mandaeans that small religious sect in Iran and southern Iraq who maintains an ancient belief resembling that of Gnosticism and that of the Parsis, which is basically another term for Zoroastrians, because they come from the area of Persia, effectively. And so let's talk some more now about the timing of Mandaeanism, where it originates and when. Most scholars date the beginnings of Mandaeanism somewhere in the first 3 centuries AD, but the matter of its origin is highly conjectural. Well, if you look at its ideology, it's very clear to see that it just originates as a Gnostic sect later in a different part of the world as Gnosticism moved out over into the area of Iran and Iraq. What about their religious texts? Well, according to the Columbia Encyclopedia, their chief holy book, the Ginza Riba, like other books, is a compendium of cosmology, cosmogony, prayers, legends, note that word legends, and rituals written at various times and often contradictory. So when it comes to the historical analysis of their writings, historians conclude that it's largely legendary and it's self-contradictory. Certainly not good grounds to be reconstructing their worldview or testing it when you have documentation on that of a level. So then we saw a second ago that this was Gnosticism. Mandaeanism was related also to another point of view called Manichaeism. And I won't reread the quote here, but we'll move on here a little bit and talk about what else it had in common. According to the Columbia Encyclopedia, the leader of Manichaeism, he went to Bactria in northwest India where he came into contact with Buddhism. And so what you find is, according to Britannica, Manichaeism is a dualistic religious movement founded in Persia in the 3rd century AD by a man named Mani, who is known as the Apostle of Light and the Supreme Illuminator. And so, again, we're talking about an ideology that's related to Gnosticism, related to Buddhism, shows that this is, even those two are conceptually related to one another in this larger global sort of pantheistic, polytheistic, mystical religion. And in the time frame here, according to the Columbia Encyclopedia, says that little is heard of the Manichaees in the West after the 6th century, and that the sect survived in the East, notably in Chinese Turkestan, until about the 13th century. So this is an extinct religion, and if we're going to look at religions and they're competing with one another for our attention and trying to determine which one's valid, it turns out that there really isn't anyone who holds to the ideology of Manichaeism today, and what there is substantially of it is essentially represented in Gnosticism or Buddhism anyway. So we can group those sort of that way. Next, I want to talk a little bit about Islam. But I want to put this video on pause for a second here. We're going to come back in the next segment and talk about Islam and its historical analysis.